The article I chose for the signature assignment is Effects of Rumination on Child and Adolescent Depressive Reactions to a Natural Disaster, the 2010 Nashville Flood. The authors are Julia Felton, David Cole, and Nina Martin. Purpose of the study. This study investigates how rumination affects depression in children and adolescents following a natural disaster. According to psychiatry.org, rumination refers to the repetitive and persistent dwelling on negative thoughts, experiences, or feelings without engaging in problem solving or seeking solutions. The data were gathered before and after the flood, and the study provided a rare opportunity to examine changes in mental health over time. In May 2010, Middle Tennessee experienced heavy rainfall and flooding. An estimated 420 billion gallons of water fell in 48 hours, breaking all state rainfall records. The flood killed over 20 people, and 26,000 people were displaced from their homes. There were significant financial losses for individuals and companies. It caused over $2 billion in property damage in Nashville alone. Hundreds of schools and businesses closed, displacing many students and employees, and personal and professional lives were disrupted for months. Methodology. This is a longitudinal study following students over time. There were 2 data collection points. Wave 1 was 6 months before the flood, and researchers were collecting data on stress and depression as part of another study at that time. Wave 2 was 10 days after students returned to school post-flood. 227 students participated in this study. They ranged anywhere from 5th to 8th grade, aged 10 to 15 years old, and they were enrolled in public schools in Middle Tennessee. Researchers proposed 3 hypotheses. The first is that pre-existing factors and flood-related factors will predict post-flood depressive symptoms. So basically, kids who had more depression or rumination before the flood and those who went through more during the flood would feel more depressed afterwards. The second is that pre-flood rumination and depression will predict post-flood rumination. Post-flood rumination will mediate the relationship between pre-flood factors and post-flood depression. So kids who ruminated or were depressed before the flood would keep ruminating after it, and that rumination would lead to more depression. And finally, the relationship between flood-related stress and post-flood depression will be stronger for older youth with high pre-flood rumination. In other words, older kids who ruminated a lot and had more flood-related stress would feel more depressed than others. 3 tests were used. The first is Children's Depression Inventory, or CDI, and that assessed depressive symptoms. The second is Response Style Questionnaire, or RSQ, which measured rumination and distraction, and for the purpose of this study, those are kind of like the opposite of each other. And finally, the researchers used Flood Experiences Questionnaire, or FEQ, which was actually also developed by them, and that measured individual flood-related experiences. So that asked children things like, did you miss school because of the flood? Did the flood get into your house or apartment? Did it ruin things in your home? Did it mess up your family's car? Just different questions that they could answer yes or no to determine how directly impacted they were. Type of analysis. Researchers used regression and correlation analyses to examine and predict post-flood depression based on pre-flood rumination, distraction, age and gender, as well as flood-related experiences. They also used bootstrapping to create a 95% confidence interval for testing the significance of indirect effects. Table 1 shows correlations between study variables before and after the flood. Predictors include pre-flood and post-flood depression, again that's CDI, rumination and distraction, those RSQ scales, age and gender, and the flood experience, or FEQ. We then have our mean, our standard deviation, and then our correlation coefficients. P-values are indicated by asterisks. And looking right here, looking at this table, pre-flood rumination had a strong positive correlation with pre-flood depression, that is R equals 0.61, with a p-value of less than 0.001. This suggests that higher rumination was associated with more depressive symptoms. There is also a strong positive correlation between post-flood rumination and post-flood depressive symptoms. This indicates that students who ruminated more after the flood were also much more likely to report higher levels of depression. There are quite a few other significant findings in this table highlighted in yellow. I just want to go over those too. Results and conclusion. This study found that kids who ruminated before the flood were more likely to ruminate after, which led to increased depressive symptoms. Pre-flood depression also led to more rumination and depression after the flood. And although distraction before the flood had a weak negative correlation with depression, it did not serve as a coping method after the flood. Rumination was more prevalent in adolescents starting at about age 11. And finally, the results show that rumination puts adolescents, but not children, at a higher risk for depression after a natural disaster. Reflection. No known conflicts of interest or bias were reported, and no specific funding source was listed. The study was conducted by Vanderbilt University, located in Nashville, where the 2010 flood occurred. Researchers had already collected data on stress and depression before the flood, giving them a rare chance to study response styles theory in a real disaster. The flood served as an external shared stressor, and this is unlike other studies where stressors may be influenced by personal depression, allowing for better control of timing and cause. The authors suggest future research should examine other emotional outcomes like post-traumatic stress. They also noted the limitation of having to create a new unvalidated flood experience measure, and they couldn't validate it before they gave it to students because school was about to let out. It was also interesting that rumination had less impact on younger children, possibly due to undeveloped response styles. And I also agree that those with prior depression and high disaster exposure should receive priority for psychological support. So that is the end, and let me know if you have any questions.